Good morning, everyone. It's fantastic to see so many bright faces at our 9 a.m. panel on a Friday after a really interesting and full day yesterday. So thank you so much for joining. So let's get started. It's our panel to discuss AI in public good. And here with me, I have Professor Philippa. I have also Jakob and Williamson. I'll let them introduce themselves. But beforehand, I would like to thank you all and thank you all the panelists for joining us today. So I think yesterday we had really insightful conversations about how AI is changing lives in a really profound way. And we are living a truly new era of discovery. And it was fascinating to see James Manica yesterday sharing how AI is accelerating the pace of breakthroughs. And I work for Google, and I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Juliana. Just noticed that. And I work for Google as James Manica. And sometimes working there, it's hard to keep track of all the amazing innovations at the company. We were discussing here in the morning. It's a lot happening, not only at Google, but in the sector as a whole. So I think working with AI, and I work for this team that's called Global Campaigns team, and I led Google's policy campaign, global policy campaign for AI, and I'm working a lot with AI in copyright. But it's amazing to see how AI is helping science discovery, is helping environmental problems, is helping education as well, and it's a good partner for problem solving and for brainstorming, for developing vaccines. So it's changing the world in a really fast manner. And the opportunity is immense, but so is the challenge. And something as working with public policy, we invest a lot of time thinking about the opportunities, but also the challenge. So we are here today with this amazing group of panelists to discuss some of the crucial components that are necessary for AI to keep fostering innovation, for enabling and also for enabling the responsible application of AI to improve lives and societies. Because at the end, we want this technology to make the world better, right? Make the world better. So I would like to give a chance for the panelists to introduce themselves, and then I'll share a first question for us to discuss. We'll have 45 minutes. For the panelists, I have a few questions that I'll do my best to moderate, and then we'll have space for Q&A. So do you want to start by introducing yourself, Professor?
Thank you, Juliana. So I'm Professor of Public International Law at the Blavatnik School of Government here in Oxford. And 11 days ago, we launched the Oxford Institute of Technology and Justice. And it was interesting, Juliana, in your examples, you mentioned science, environment, and education, but not justice. And that's why we're trying to fill that gap, because lawyers and legal institutions tend to move slowly and traditionally, and they've been very behind with harnessing the power of AI. So that's what the Oxford Institute is going to focus on.
Amazing. And we have really good and interesting examples that I was seeing in Brazil, how the Supreme Court is also using AI to improve access to justice. So it's something that is amazing indeed. Thank you. And you, Jakob?
Hello, everyone. I'm Jakob. I'm the Director of Science and Technology Policy at the Tony Blair Institute. The TBI is a global nonprofit that advises political leaders on strategy and policy. So we help countries, for example, write national AI policy, but also thinking around how to regulate emerging technologies. My own background is dual in engineering and social science, so I started out doing a few engineering degrees and then actually did my PhD here at Oxford Internet Institute. So I'm very happy to be back. It feels like coming home.
So good. And you, Professor?
Brian Williamson. I'm a partner at a consultancy called Communications Chambers. My interest is the intersection really of economics, public policy and technology has a lot to do with AI at the moment and for the foreseeable future. Background physics and economics.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So to open our discussion, I want to start asking our panelists, which are the core principles that define AI for the public good? Could you share an example of an AI application you've seen recently that truly excited you, and what made it so impactful? Maybe we start with you.
Okay.
Yes.
So I've often seen in the dialogue around AI for good this real focus on, understandably, medicine, climate, weather prediction, wildfire tracking, and so on. All of this is really important and really impactful. But I think AI for the public good has to widen the lens and think about, and I'm looking through a justice lens here, inclusion, empowerment, and access as part of that good as well, instead of just wide impact. And I just want to give you 2 examples that we're working on at the Oxford Institute that are designed to expand access to justice for people in underserved communities. So we're looking at Malawi, which with a population of 22 million people has 800 lawyers. And not many of those lawyers are working on human rights. And even fewer of those lawyers are working on human rights for women and girls. So Malawi has kind of perfect legislation on protecting women and girls, prohibiting child marriage, and yet 37% of girls in Malawi are married before the age of 18. And that comes with all kinds of knock-on effects in terms of abuse, economic status, even life expectancy. So we're looking at how we can scale access to justice for this community. And we've been working with Microsoft to develop 2 tools. One is a Malawi lawyer's assistant that will help the few lawyers who are working on these topics to actually do more. So what we're doing is first having a tool that will help them provide affidavits for protective orders more quickly. That's usually a very time-consuming process, and here with AI, it can be done in a fraction of the time. And the second tool we're working on is the Malawi legal chatbot with the Women Lawyers Association for Malawi, where women and girls on low-tech devices can access legal resources and be connected with pro bono legal representation, even if they're in really remote communities. And this is working on WhatsApp on low-tech devices, so it's not something that's unattainable for them. Now, these are just in the prototype stage at the moment. We're testing with hundreds of lawyers and women and girls at the moment. But if this kind of model works, we hope this is an example of AI for public good in the legal space that could be applied elsewhere.
That's so interesting. And also the way that they will adopt the technology, right? Because they don't even they're not even included sometimes in the legal system as in a broad manner, and also technology. So it sort of bridges 2 gaps at the same time.
Exactly.
Really interesting.
Thanks. Is it okay if I ask a question on that? Or
I think we could,
Yes,
right?
of course.
Please, let's make this.
especially when you're working in those local regional communities,
Yes.
if they have, let's say, legal matters that involve tensions within that community, what support are they getting in this dialogue so that they feel safe and protected driving these cases, even if they get good legal advice?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and that's why we're starting in Malawi. Because in Malawi, the government is actually really in favour of this project. The government wants to close the gap between the law on paper and the law in practice. Yeah. And we also have a really great partner in the Women Lawyers Association for Malawi, who we've worked with for years through the Clooney Foundation for Justice. So there's these known quantities that reduce or mitigate that risk. At the same time, I think earlier in this program, you would have heard from Sarah Wahidi, who is part of the Oxford Institute. She's our technology specialist, and she's been doing this work in Afghanistan, which is at the other extreme, where it's the most hostile environment for trying to expand access to justice, and she still had success there. Okay. So it is possible, but we're starting with Malawi for various reasons.
And I think you raised a great point, and maybe you could explore a little bit how those innovations and the public good and the good impact and benefits for society depend not only on society adopting that, but also the public policy supporting and enabling that. So would you like to explore a little bit of that?
Yeah, definitely. So just if we start with the principle for public good, I think of it in 2 different buckets. One is where we use specific types of AI to solve problems already here and now today. I mean, for example, there's so much in public services that still requires, me to print, for example, proof of address when I go to the bank. I'm a guest in this country, and when I try to do that. So any time of, let's say, digital identities and things that makes it easier to get public services that is here now. But I think when many people talk about public good, they also talk about AI's potential to raise general productivity levels and contribute to material welfare of society. So if you take the current Labour government's top priority is economic growth, and historic different drivers of growth have been, for example, population growth, which is currently stagnant, globalization, which is currently in decline, and that basically leaves technology innovation as more or less sort of the last straw that the government is sort of grasping after in the hope of growth. So those, I would say, were the two principles: either apply directly to solve problems or to boost long-term growth. In terms of use cases, let's take one from us. So given that we mainly work with political leaders, one of the things we have recently developed together with governments is policy simulators and policy explorers. So for example, when you do policy, one of the first questions you ask, what have other countries done in this space? Who can we learn from? What has worked in other contexts? And that used to be a hugely resource-intensive, cost-intensive, and time-consuming task to just find out, for example, what are different policies around the world for, let's say, planning laws for data center or intellectual property rights. Now we have that database that collates from over 200 countries, and we can very quickly explore the option space. That doesn't mean that you automatically get an answer from the machine of what is the best policy. That is still very much a normative, value-laden, and context-specific question. But God, it's helpful to quickly get the research done on knowing what the option space are. So that's something that I'm very excited about.
Really cool.
Okay, a slightly different perspective, but complementary. I think when we talk about the public good, we sometimes think of that as kind of government, but I think there's both a private consumption of AI, which is part of the public good, and then there are kind of things that are we have a collective interest in. So I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that enabling people to get the AI they want, according to their preferences, and to get it on a timely basis is important for the private interest element of the public good. And a recent example of that being impeded actually by supposedly public interested regulation was Apple announced the new AirPods with live translation. That is not available in European Union. So I would say that goes against the public good. In terms of collective interests, well, one other point I'll make, which I think may turn out to be significant, it's very hard to know, is that I have used AI in a very preliminary way in ways that reduce what an economist would call information asymmetries. When I'm dealing with services, if I have a problem. And indeed, I even went to the point of getting it to write a letter and getting a substantial refund on something recently, which I'd never normally bother to do. And so I think if you can reduce those kind of costs of interacting, some of the markets that don't work might start to work. I know some people think AI will diminish the role of markets, but in that sense, it may expand them. And because it has the potential to solve a lot of those market problems. Shall I go into my example? Yes. The kind of public good example I've thought about was Google DeepMind AlphaFold. It's almost not new at the pace things are changing, but it was significant. And I thought it was significant before that development was awarded, Nobel Prize, and that kind of reinforced the sense that it's significant. So if you're not familiar, DNA, well, one of the key things DNA does is encode for amino acid sequences, which makes up proteins, and that is a lot of what is going on in a living organism. And it's the structure of those proteins that determines their behavior. And we didn't have a way of predicting the structure of a protein from a sequence of DNA and amino acids. So we did it experimentally, and we had maybe of order 100,000 structures that were known. It was kind of colloquially, I think it's a PhD per structure. And AlphaFold was able to learn from a existing database of protein structures, so that emphasizes the role of data. And was able to predict now, I think, several 100 million protein structures. So it's 3 orders of magnitude more than we knew before. And that's a kind of foundational technology for advances in medicine and biotechnology. So I think that will have quite... There are other technologies on top of that now. That was the kind of foundational layer. And we will see an acceleration of the development of new medicines and other things.
Great example. I'm suspicious to say because I'm a huge fan of AlphaFold, but I think that's a great example. You wanted to do a follow-up question?
Yeah, well, it was more... I thought the point you mentioned about market was interesting. I wanted to learn a bit more about that because I think the standard narrative is Hayek said we need markets because of decentralized knowledge. No central bureaucracy can, know all the different needs and allocate resources. But then at the same time, we see that Amazon might know when my, let's say, stock of shampoo is out before and automatically sent. And if that is true, then do we need markets for that, or can we algorithmically instead allocate resources? So what is your view? Will AI sort of facilitate markets or replace it?
I think we will want to have agency as individuals, and to the extent that we opt in to systems like that, that's fine in a sense. But I think in our daily lives, we'll be wanting to express our preferences. And so in that sense, I think markets stay there because there's no way a central authority can know what my preferences will be, for lunch in an hour's time. I don't know, probably. And so I think that kind of, you won't solve that decentralized information problem. Some people have also kind of made the point that in a world where you have lots of AIs in the market, there might be asymmetries between them as well. So I think that kind of persists. And the kind of interesting point is that maybe actually you expand a little the scope for markets because, I don't know if people are familiar with Coasian way of thinking, which is these bargaining problems where you might even be able to solve some collective action problems by people having an agent that represents their interests. And those agents could negotiate with one another. So maybe I don't like my neighbour mowing their lawn at 9 a.m. My agent says, well, I would pay you $5 to do that later or something like that. So there is a kind of hypothetical world in which some of these things that just aren't possible because we haven't got the time or inclination to negotiate them could be negotiated by agents on our behalf.
I think Professor...
I wanted to come back on that and the sort of concern that is arising around cognitive de-skilling when we delegate to agents to negotiate or write letters and so on. Now, obviously, the lawn mowing example or the getting a refund on something fairly routine is not that example. That's not really testing our cognitive skills. But if we start to delegate the kind of frictions in our lives, are we then going to be losing the skills? And not just us, like younger generations, losing those skills of how to negotiate, how to find the common ground, empathy, even persuasive advocacy, and so on.
Yeah, I think technology does change our skill sets. And of course, historically, people worried even about writing because people lost the skill of memory. They remembered large volumes of text. So I think it's good and bad. I mean, in a sense, technology isn't helping you if you're not de-skilled a bit because you should be delegating something to the technology. When I dig the garden with a spade, I'm not using my muscles as much as if I had to do it with a piece of wood or something. But it's legitimate to worry that in some cases it might be harmful, and people are concerned at the moment about the decline in reading, for example. I think there'll be good and bad on that front.
I think you raised two interesting things now. First, agency, that we need people to have agency over the technology, and the second one, the skills we need. So, and you also mentioned, Brian, we need to enable the AI people want. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on which are those enablers. Jakob mentioned the public policy system and frameworks that can enable people to have access to justice through new enablers and new AI tools. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on those enablers. What's crucial to make AI have a really good impact in society? Maybe you could start, Professor Philippa?
Oh, me again.
Sorry, I can start and like mix it. We can mix it up. I'm just following the order there.
Okay, no, happy to. So again, looking through the access to justice lens, I think the critical enabler is accessibility and openness. So there's a core principle of law common to every legal system and also applicable on the international plane, which is that the law has to be accessible. And the converse of that is that you can't claim ignorance of the law as an excuse for violating the law. Now, often these principles are just paid lip service to, because the law may technically be findable, you know, maybe deep in a database behind a paywall on the 200th page of a PDF, or it might be in another language, or it might be written in such an obscure way, or in the common law, as we have in England and Wales, it means you have to not just look at the statute, but look at how it's been interpreted, and what's the most recent and highest interpretation of that. And all of this requires skills and time and energy and often cost as well. So when we are thinking about how AI can enable access to justice, and part of that making the law accessible, I think overcoming this kind of obscurity of the law and inaccessibility of these rules is really important. And one of the tools that we're working on is a global human rights repository with HuriDocs, thanks to Google, actually. Our idea is, at the moment, international human rights decisions are spread across about 15 different databases that vary in terms of their search terms, whether you have to pay for them, how the documents are stored, and we want to put them all in one global human rights repository powered by an LLM, where you can ask, you know, natural language prompts and get authoritative, well-cited answers. And that would be open access, and the idea there is that civil society or, you know, individual defense counsel and defendants are going to have access to this in a way that is quite difficult at the moment.
That's amazing. Is there a way as well to translating really complex pieces of information and making those accessible?
Yeah.
Can I ask on that? So, when it comes to the law specifically,
Yeah.
How much of the legal process do you think itself can be automated, and what parts of it do you think will always have to be human discretion and judgment?
This is a big project, actually, and we're working on it. I think, so there's not a clear answer to it yet. I think there's some obvious examples where I think you can automate quite a lot. So small claims. Nearly every jurisdiction has them. Often people are self-represented. So this is the result if you didn't get the refund from your letter. You go to small claims court, and for under a certain amount of money, you make your case as a layperson. That is being automated in many jurisdictions, and I think that's working quite well. I think at the other end of the spectrum, complex criminal proceedings, whether they're international criminal law and crimes against humanity and so on, or crimes where people are going to lose their liberty as a potential outcome, I would believe there's always going to be a human element to that. I don't know what that looks like yet. Does it mean you always have to have a human in the loop? Or does it mean that you could have a first decision that's AI generated and you always have an option of appeal to a human? Or is the human working in tandem with the AI in a very transparent way? And there may be different approaches in different places in different cases. But that's where I think we're always going to want a human element.
And I think there's something interesting to that also the justice system needs to be open for that as well,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's one of the enablers when the governments and the public policy frameworks, they're open to having another tool to improve access to public services, right? So I would love to hear your thoughts, Jakob, on other types of infrastructural enablers or skilling that we mentioned. We need the skills, we need the access to the technology. Which are the other enablers that comes?
So, let me answer that in a slightly roundabout way, because I also want to stress, I think, the urgency here. When we talk about the public good, as you said before, this doesn't limit itself to the government. This is sort of the collective welfare of a society and the surplus that we all enjoy. And let's say that we have something today that we enjoy and that we want to preserve and see flourish in the future. We're not on a good track at the moment. Our societies and way of life are actually eroded from both external and internal threats. So if you take external, there is such a thing as geopolitical, military, economic competition, and we see both stagnation in Europe and the UK. Internally, we see slides towards populism and right-wing parties, for example, in the UK and also in Europe. And I think that leaning into the opportunities of new technology will be central to meeting both of these challenges. On a geopolitical space, you only have a seat on your table if you also have capabilities that earn you that seat at the table. But also domestically, I think a lot of the populism we see is a reflection of a lack of trust in the institution and their ability to deliver. And to some extent, it's true. If citizens experience a lot of friction when interacting with the government and public services, they will say this is not working, and it can come a point where people rather burn the house down than try to reform it. And that we are seeing across the world. So I think there is a real urgency in leaning into it. Now, it's important to separate two things. One is the general progress of sort of techno-scientific evolution, and the other is applied generative AI tools specifically. If you view AI too narrowly as, let's say, the latest large language model, then the hopes that are currently pitched on AI is not justifiable. But if you rather view AI as the more or less code word for continuous technology progress and innovation, then we need to put enablers in place that allow that over and beyond the application of the current large language model. So when we talk about enablers, this is not just to maximize the benefits in the next 1, 2, or 3 years, but really to build structured pathway to continuously integrate new and more powerful technology as they come, whether that is multimodal models, whether that is embodied AI systems and robotics, and so on. And of course, do that in a way. So the most important thing, if you look at the UK, the biggest constraining factor right now is, without a doubt, energy costs. And energy cost is an enabler not just for AI, but also for good living standard, public good in general. Many people in the UK struggling with energy bills as it is. How to address that is, of course, a combination of many different things. We have planning laws, we have different kinds of energy resources that might be currently suboptimally subsidized, so there's a policy aspect too. When it comes to skill, just to take a very concrete example, TBI and Ipsos recently did a polling of UK adults, and we found that 25% are using AI on a weekly basis. On the one hand, that is encouraging for a technology that is just 3 to 4 years old. But we also saw that 50% of UK adults are never using generative AI. And that means maybe there are some people in the population for which it's not useful, maybe some elderly people, maybe some professions, but still that is really a sign that we haven't reached the level of uptake and utility that we could. And here, when we then correlated that with different parameters, a lack of skills was definitely the biggest one. And another thing was a lack of trust, and they were correlated. So people who knew how to use AI also had a higher trust in AI. So there's a virtuous cycle between trust and skills. I think I'll pause there.
But it's really interesting, this connection between trust and skill, but because it also reflects the overall environment that we need to enable. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think historically we've been overly focused on regulation of AI rather than regulation in what I maybe call for AI. Mm-hmm. And regulation for AI is both kind of upstream of AI. We've mentioned talent, energy, text and data mining. We need to enable all of these things because they're inputs to AI. I think we should either have a very light touch approach or not regulate the development of models at all. I think that's just the wrong place to focus regulation. The harms will come downstream from AI. And to give some examples of what I mean downstream, if you take the AlphaFold example, let's assume that accelerates the discovery of new medicines. I think it has already contributed to the development of some candidates. They will have to go through a testing process. And in a sense, that is the regulation for safety. It happens there, we've already got it. You don't need to regulate AlphaFold, you regulate medicines. But I think if innovation in the medical side accelerates, the institutions that approve medicines will be overwhelmed. So we need to build capacity, both kind of parallel capacity for testing more drugs before they go to market, but maybe even changing the testing process to speed it up if that's possible. And then downstream from that, To give one example, Waymo is going to operate in London next year. Why is that possible? Well, in part, it's because the government thought ahead on that issue and created a framework for self-driving cars. But that's regulation for AI. We need to put in place, in some cases, new legal frameworks to actually allow things to happen. Another example is a lot of things in our society govern what I would call human credentials. If a doctor wants to prescribe a medicine, they have to be qualified to do that. We will rapidly get to the point where AI might be able to do some of those things, but it won't be permitted to because it can't have human credentials. It cannot be a qualified person. And in Europe, about 20% of jobs have this kind of qualification. So we need to think of something that's more kind of outcomes-based rather than based on human skills. And the driving example is similar because what we do at the moment is we test the driver to make sure they're sufficiently skilled to drive the car. You need a kind of different approach for autonomous vehicles. So I don't think we've grasped the magnitude of that problem. There will be many, some technologists think AI is going to take over everything in very quick order, but actually there are many things in society that AI is currently not permitted to do. And we need to think about those. In some cases, we may want to conclude that it shouldn't. And an example that I think might be in that category is a very old institution in the UK is trial by jury, the right to trial by jury. We might want to keep it that way. But we might want to be have a trial by our fellow citizens rather than, say, an AI. Even if it was better, we might want it to do it that way. So I think we need to start thinking about this kind of regulation.
He wants trial by AI.
Yeah, you want trial. Well, maybe you could opt into it.
I wonder if that is almost comes down to the heart of the tension between the liberal and the democratic elements of liberal democracy.
Yeah, I mean, well, there are some things, in the end, we will make democratic choices about these things. But I think in terms of the policy focus historically has been on, there's this new thing, how do we regulate it? And it's a general purpose technology. And if you think back historically, we typically don't regulate general purpose technology. We regulate their applications.
And I know we should not make this conversation about kind of legal practice, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that, for example, in many countries, practices like the death penalty would never have been abolished if it had been democratic processes. It was often opposed top-down by normative liberal vision. And I think you will find similar things when it comes to jury and AI decisions too.
Yeah, and there is an interesting point on when we discuss regulation. You said something quite interesting, that regulating AI and regulating for AI, and I think it connects to something that James Manica brought yesterday, that we think a lot about regulating the harms and how we can protect societies, but without the right regulation and the frameworks, AI won't happen as well, because those enablers won't happen. So, and there is this saying from Sundar Pichai, Google CEO, that he says that AI is too important not to be regulated and too important not to be regulated well. And I think it also brings some interesting thoughts that, so we were discussing the opportunities and the enablers, but also there are challenges around AI and its application and how society are using that. So which are the key challenges that you see that we need to pay attention to and to collectively and democratically discuss how we can tackle those? So maybe we could start with Jakob, just to invert the order.
Sure. Let's go a little bit into the politics of AI and change here. So I think what often happens when you have a radical technology shift is that even if there might be aggregated benefits for society, let's say over 20 or 30 or 40 years, any technology shift will also reconfigure the structure of a society, and that will move different power centers, it will move benefits, negotiating positions. And that means that almost per definition, you will have people who are invested in the status quo, so the incumbents and the entrenched people. And who are better placed to lobby the current political leaders and to impose regulations? Well, that is often the companies and the interests who are here today. So all of those political conflict doesn't have to be seen as a sort of left and right or worker versus capitalist, but it can also be technology owners of existing entrenched technologies or of future potential technologies. So I think that one challenge will definitely be, how do we create structures that are open towards change. That doesn't mean that there should be a no strings attached approach, but how we overcome that sort of element that is not cautionary in the sense of care, but cautionary in the sense of protecting basically privileges. So I think that's a big challenge, and we see some of that in the UK when it comes to, for example, planning, taxation, and other things. Internationally, I think by far the biggest challenge now is the lack of working international pathways for standardization of, for example, technologies, certification, governance. Just think that even if you were purely interested in trade and technology progress, you would want to have a certain level playing field, harmonization of standard, so that technology companies don't have to use, let's say, 15 different certification processes in UK, US, India, EU. And I don't know how many of you listened to the speeches of the US. I think it was Michael Kratsios at ANGA last year, was spelling out very clearly the American position right now. And that means the next few years will be challenging from a governance perspective.
Okay, thank you. And what about you?
Yeah. Well, there's what I've already said about regulation for AI, which I think is quite distinct from regulating AI itself. And I would caution against imposing any centralized regulation of the models per se. I think the focus should be downstream, which it was with other technologies. We didn't really regulate software or computing or steam or electricity in a sense. We regulated particular applications. So I think that's a mistake we should avoid. On this point about disruption and vested interests, I think this year's Nobel in economics was interesting because one of the winners, Mökander, I probably haven't pronounced his name correctly, who's an economic historian, wrote a book called The Culture of Growth, which I have not read yet, but will. But I've asked AI about his book, so I know everything already.
Was it AI friendly, its reply?
I asked about him and what his thinking was. And I think one of the key things he says that, it's not inevitable that an economy will grow or that you'll make progress. A lot of things have to come together. You have to be optimistic about the future. And I think we've got to the point where we're a bit pessimistic in Europe. And we have a principle in Europe called the precautionary principle, and that seems contrary to the kind of culture of growth that he talks about. So I think that's problematic. At the other side of it, the other Nobel winners were about creative destruction, which raises these very difficult issues about winners and losers. It's inevitable that happens when you have a new technology and allow it to progress things. And people are worried that rate of creative destruction will be too high, but I think and that is possible, but I think AI will not diffuse as fast as some of the technical optimists think, because of all the barriers that we haven't thought about yet. And I think something people don't appreciate is the underlying rate of creative destruction in the US economy. I think roughly 15% of jobs are created and destroyed every year, which is enormous. So the amount of churn that's going on in the economy is high.
You say 15%?
15, yeah. And firm entry and exit is high as well. That number has actually been declining in Western countries over time. So we're not living in an era of rapid change at the moment, actually. It has been, the rate of change has been declining, as has the rate of productivity growth. So I'm all for a bit of acceleration. And
as long as it's effective.
Yeah, and I think governments are starting to realise that not having productivity growth is quite problematic. The Labour government in this country has kind of recognised that that's a challenge, because it means they can't spend the money on the things they want to, or they'll have to raise taxation. So, and if we want to fund the health system and so on, you do need growth. So what am I saying? Remove the barriers to change. Do something to protect the losers. We already have a system. Is it adequate? I don't know. The welfare system we've got, will that be adequate to deal with this technology? I don't know the answer to that. And be ready to adapt quickly. I think it's very hard to think ahead 5 to 10 years and anticipate everything. We need a more adaptive society. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. We said creative structures, open to change, adapt, protect the losers. So I'll pass it over to Professor Philippa, and then we'll start Q&A. So prepare your questions.
So I think what we're all speaking about here is that gap between good intent and good ideas, promising technology, and then good application, good deployment. And Jakob and Brian have spoken about how regulation is not filling that gap properly, and there's ways in which we can have more flexible or even no regulation. I'm looking more locally to fill that gap between good intent and good deployment, and that's the idea of co-creation of these tools. So again, like not a top-down imposition, but if we are developing tools that are actually going to be sustainable, tailored to the communities that they're targeted at, those communities need to be involved in their creation, adaptation, revision, and so on. And I think that's something that's starting to be talked about, but again, like with how to adapt the regulatory framework, it's really lagging behind compared to the rate of speed of technological development in this space. And I think it's just so important that we're not imposing these tools and all the unintended consequences that come from that, and that we're involving the users in them. Now, that doesn't have to be in a democratic, like a strictly democratic way, and it can be very, very local. And there's amazing local technologists around the world. That's one of the amazing things about AI. But I think it does require more attention. I had a question for Brian, actually, and I know you've got one too, Jakob. When you said, let's look at electricity or software or steam, where we didn't regulate the technology itself, but regulated downstream. I mean, one difference with those technologies is that they weren't exponentially growing and developing in the way that AI is, and they didn't have the ability to cognitively exceed us.
They didn't have the ability to cognitively exceed us. They did have the ability to exceed us greatly in terms of physical strength, both steam power and electricity. And orthodox computing did exceed us enormously in limited domains. It can calculate faster than people. So a lot of things that people used to do, there were human computers before there were computers who just did calculations, and then we had computers, and then we had spreadsheets. So, and in terms of an exponential, the Industrial Revolution was at least exponential growth over a long period of time. So I'm not sure exponentials are a new thing. Yeah.
But maybe to square that, I think the point is probably not to say there are no requirements at the model layer. There are. But the question is, do we need to regulate that? Or if you put clear regulation on use cases in different sectors, then there are many other mechanisms to force that upstream. For example, different organizations will have liability contracts between them, use cases between model providers. There are also just good engineering practices because you want your solutions to be reliable, predictable. And these are all merits that are not necessarily legal in nature, but they can be technical specification liability. So I think we need requirements at different layers, use cases, models, training data, but not all of that needs to be horizontal regulation.
I should have said that precisely. And so in a sense, I distinguish between, endogenous things and exogenous things. And a lot of that feedback from the downstream regulation to the models will happen endogenously in the market and through legal action. We don't necessarily need law for that.
And I know you want to bring in a question. I just had a super quick one. When you say co-creation, this is one of the terms that always comes up and that I really think also sounds good. But what are the best examples you have seen in practice of large-scale technologies being successfully co-created with different kind of user groups and communities?
I don't think we have it yet.
I was wishing you would come up with it.
Yeah, but we're doing it on a really small scale. So in the Malawi example that I talked about, the legal chatbot, from the very beginning, we've been working with the Women Lawyers Association, physically sitting next to them. This is very low tech. Physically sitting next to them, seeing how they fill out affidavits, seeing how AI can improve that process, testing it with them in actual interviews. And it's actually led to a surprising number of adjustments. Now, as a lawyer, you may think, I know how to efficiently fill out an affidavit. Well, you don't know how to do that in Malawi. and you don't know how to do that necessarily with survivors of, domestic violence. So, that's a small scale example, but I think the same principles of actually having the humility to think that you can learn from the users is a really important principle.
Yeah, I agree. So yes, great. So prepare your questions. I think we have 10 minutes for Q&A. And okay, so over to you.
Wait, just so everybody can hear you.
Okay.
First of all, thank you so much. It was a very, very wonderful panel because, it talked about practical implementations of some of the policies and regulations that we talk about. Implementation always is very tricky, especially with the evolving technology. With co-creation, there was this course that we developed in Pakistan, which was AI for artisans. And it was these micro entrepreneurs sitting at their home, women entrepreneurs doing stuff. And, we actually hit a roadblock because when we went there, in some parts they were okay with these usual AI tools that are available to all of us, but in others, they were struggling with language. So, then we realized that probably one AI solution doesn't, even across a country for 4 provinces, doesn't work for everyone. And then we worked with the university to do a local language Urdu, version for them, which can help them. And it's still being created, but when you work on ground, then you realize that there are the small issues that we probably might not be able to sort when you're sitting on tables and stuff. My question to you is that you talked about policy simulations, with the Tony Blair Institute, and that is such a critical thing because it's evolving so much, you just can't catch up. So is the work only for the global north at the moment, or is it also like across different countries, and how can we be part of it if one wants to be a part of it?
Okay, so a few different questions in there. The first is very simple. No, this is not just for the global north. This is very much also for countries in developing context. I would even say it's probably more useful in some development contexts where they lack state capacity or large bureaucracies. So for example, if you look in the UK, I don't know how many civil servants we have in the room, but we do have a fairly sizable state bureaucracy, same in the US, same in Germany and so on. But you have countries also where even having a team of 5 or 10 people studying a problem, let's say, for example, how to plan against climate disaster, makes a huge difference. And in those cases, whether that is Indonesia, Rwanda, Brazil, it makes the biggest difference. However, I should stress this, it's also the most tricky to do good policy simulation in developing context because you don't always have the proper data. So, for example, which countries have the best health data records in the world? Well, it's probably Netherlands and Denmark. UK could be one if we had centralized databases. We don't. But if you try to do public policy simulation in some developing context, you must be very careful with what you do with that because you can't just take and implement there. Right? You have to use that computationally as just one input into your decision-making process. And the second thing about participation, let's take that separately.
Okay, think there, then there. Maybe we could bundle, I think, both questions. I think there was someone with raised hand, and then we all answer because I don't think we have a lot of time, unfortunately.
Good morning. I'm Maurice from TikTok on the policy team. My question is related to transparency and accountability. How do you account for not exposing too much of the decision-making processes so that the malicious actors don't try to exploit those loopholes? And the example I'll give is when we're considering our content moderation, people often want to know, hey, why was my content removed? We have certain rules and procedures that we don't expose to the public, so that way we don't have people who are looking for those edge cases and can find those gaps and exploit them.
We could take a couple.
Yeah, we'll take the second question here, and then we...
My question is about the definition of the public good. And when I think about the public good, I see 2 big angles. One of them is the open sourcing, like super valuable technologies like AI. And the other one is the human-centered designs, like at the core of it. Actually, TBI has a great document there on the human-centered policy design and how to think about, like, if you're designing something about healthcare, just think about yourself as a patient thing. So on the first one, I see on the Google side, for example, because of the huge competition, there is less and less open kind of sharing of discoveries. Transformer is a great one, for example. It was a Google discovery, but then laid the ground for all of the other Gen AI developments later on. What is your opinion on that one? How can we make sure that there is still a strong open source and collective sharing of information, knowledge, actually? And the second one is human-centered design, especially from a legal perspective and a policy perspective. Thank you.
Maybe I can just answer from a Google perspective on transparency, because you raised a really interesting thing that I come from the open source community back in the day. And it's something that yesterday James Monica shared a lot about open source, and openness is one of the things that we value a lot at Google. There is one thing that when I started working with AI at Google, it caught my attention, is that how we release model cards on everything we're developing, and some reports that you can find online on things that we tested that didn't go well, so we can support other developers to get it right. And I think we have our principles, and we release every year how we are considering our principles and measuring impact of our applications. So I think there is this commitment from Google to be as transparent and available, and everything is just really accessible online. So I really recommend that. The model card is something that I got to learn when I started working with AI, and they are really interesting information about our products and services.
I think one comment I'd make, which answers, well, is related to two questions, is you know, how open something should be is quite a nuanced question. And there's a tendency for policymakers to just say, well, let's mandate transparency. Or on the other hand, if you kind of mandate excessive regulation of the models themselves, you may prevent open source. So I think we need to be careful about pushing it too far one way or the other, because the optimal amount of openness depends on the details and the circumstances. The other point I'd make is that there are very large investments going on, and people do eventually have to make some money out of AI. So a lot is open, but it can't all be open. Yeah.
Do you want to
I
comment?
can comment on the first question about transparency and how you strike that balance with the potential for malicious actors to take advantage of that. So the first point is that there's already existing legal frameworks for this. We're talking about qualified rights to both transparency and privacy. And we have, for many decades, explored how you strike the right balance between transparency, privacy, and now national security as an issue as well. So there's a lot where we've seen applications of that in practice that we can learn from, including looking at whether there's a legitimate purpose for not granting the transparency, which security may well be, and often is, and also seeing whether it's proportionate, which is part of the detailed case in question. But I would just say more broadly on the challenges of security and accountability in this space that we definitely need more work on this. And it's quite, and James Monica has spoken about this before, it's quite unfortunate that in the high-level panel on AI governance, security was just too difficult to reach any conclusion on, however non-binding, that they just haven't dealt with it. So now this is in the hands of every sovereign state to, at the moment, make up their minds on it. So it is definitely an area in which it's not going to go away as a problem that we have to balance out.
Okay, go ahead, and then I think we'll have to wrap up. Over to you. Oh, the mic. Where is the mic? But I think people that are watching online won't hear you.
This is a slightly more stratospheric question, so forgive me. The world is pretty divided, and I think that there's a lot of reasons to attribute social media for those divisions by arguments being polarized for monetization. And I'm not blaming anybody on the panel, but I think we all know there are parties who have monetized this extremely well. One of the things that fascinates me about AI is that if you use a chatbot to probe a specific topic, it tends to create an answer that is far more thoughtful and tends to be less polarizing than if you were to go on to a meta platform and ask a question which would tend to divide you or make you feel more irritated about something. Now, I wonder if it would be possible not only to protect that bonding of people with differing opinions, but whether it's conceivable that AI will actually bring communities together, and we should focus on it a little bit more.
I can talk a little bit about that. So there is a quite big literature on, it's called AI-aided mediation, and that is both sort of looking at how to structure democratic discourse, but also between nations. So if you think about, for example, what President Macron, I know maybe not the best example right now, but did a couple of years ago when he went around in France and did town halls with citizens and voters to meet the concern of the Yellow Vest, the digital vest. It's very much possible to imagine scenarios where one had online consultation, where one broke them down in different clusters depending on people's preferences and started to build consensus bottom up. And there's work ongoing on that from an academic point of view. I would say in practice, implementing any of that would be as difficult as implement voter reform in the UK. You can come up with all good theoretical examples why ranked choice voting is better, let's say, than first post the bar and constituency. So the blockers here, I see and agree with your point that the technological affordances are there. The blockers here will clearly be political.
I think if you just focus on the information space, I think there are already some examples of AI being integrated. On X, for example, you can look at something. I do sometimes see something and I think, is that right? I can get Grok to look at it and it will kind of check, is this factual or not? And community notes, which is the kind of concept where you get people who have divergent views. If they agree on a comment, then that can go up. So I think people are very focused at the moment on AI creating fakes and so on, but I think on the counterpart of that is that it can be quite helpful in the information space. And we haven't seen much of that yet, but I think we will see it applied much more.
And I would just add that the ISWAY Foundation is actively looking into this and creating a global citizens assembly facilitated by AI. And one of the interesting things about it is not just the technology of being able to survey 10 million people, 100 million people in a really iterative way. But one of the big problems with actually getting people involved in participatory processes is the information deficit. And AI is very good at summarizing, presenting in an accessible form the key points that you need to know. So they're also looking at that there would be a kind of leveling of the information available through these really accessible multilingual ways, and then the AI-mediated polling and deliberation.
Yes, and I think as we wrap up, I just wanted to share a few thoughts that I was collecting. So we talked a lot about urgency and how we accelerate adoption, infrastructure, access, so we can enjoy the benefits of AI, as, for example, improving access to justice. We discussed how we can create a structure for change. I love it. And then regulating for AI, skilling, energy, how local communities can be part of that. We discussed openness, and as local communities also, how can AI bring people together? So I think I'm leaving with lots of thoughts on how we can build this infrastructure, how we can enable AI to actually improve our lives and people's lives as well. So thank you so much. Join me in a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you for your questions, and I'll see you around.